Good evening, everyone. I welcome all of you on behalf of the South Asian Allyship Network, SAN, to our fourth webinar series on Black Lives Matter, focusing on racial solidarity and education and confronting anti-Black racism in the classroom. My name is Ananya Banerjee. I identify as she and her, and I'm a professor from the Dalhousie School of Public Health, University of Toronto. With respect to my positionality, I'm fully aware of my privileged South Asian identity as being cisgendered Hindu, Indian, and Brahmin, child of immigrant parents who came for economic opportunities in the 70s. As someone who's very dedicated to combating anti-Black racism in higher education, particularly in the university settings, I realize I have much more to learn and unlearn. And hopefully this will be an opportunity for all of us through this webinar to work together in solidarity. I am about to share a land acknowledgement as an invitation to inquiry and to reflect how we deepen our relationship with the land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge this land I speak on as a settler, which has been home to current and longstanding Indigenous communities. I'm socially conscious as a settler. I have been the beneficiary of Canada's policies that have discriminated against Indigenous communities and continues to do so. As a professor of public health at the University of Toronto, I am committed to truth and reconciliation and will support my Indigenous students and colleagues and their communities to affirm their inherent rights. For me to say this is a continuous wake-up call and a call to action to where and how we can learn more, whether it is about the Mi'kmaq fishing rights, the 1942 land back lane, justice for Joyce. Understanding Annual Orange Shirt Day that took place yesterday is asking us in education and beyond to wear orange shirts to remember how injustice residential schools were to Indigenous children, to remember who survived and those who didn't. It is to honor a young female student named by Phyllis Webstead from Williams Lake, BC, who had her new bright orange shirt taken away when she arrived at residential school. We need to understand the last one closed in 1996. Therefore, this isn't not only a deep history, this is our present day. Modern racism is playing an active role in the daily lives of our Indigenous students, affecting both their academic and personal success. In the future, we hope to bring you a webinar series on anti-Indigenous racism to unravel South Asian complicities in the ongoing processes of colonization of Indigenous people and lands. The Black Lives Matter movement in the education space has parallels with Indigenous injustice that share dark realities of Canada's shameful history of racism and speaking out against present-day racism in our education systems to this date, and in unity to end white violence and silence. These similar disparities in their educational experience are not a coincidence, but rather the result of the underlying powerful structures on Canada as a settler colonial state. So I ask all of you in this audience, as a South Asian, how are you committed to end state violence against Black students, which is the focus of our current webinar series in the context of education? How are you making Black Lives Matter in the classroom? When it comes to our Black students, they face a historical, unprecedented, and unique anti-Black prejudice as the ultimate other, propagated by both white supremacy and, yes, all of us who are part of non-Black racialized communities in education spaces, including us as South Asian educators, students, staff, and parents. There are various educational concerns that Black students from Toronto and surrounding regions share. Lack of racial diversity among teachers, Black people and Black history not reflected in the curriculum, tolerance of racist incidents in schools, harsher discipline of Black students, being over-monitored by police and security guards, streaming of Black students into courses below their ability, lack of mentorship, not highlighting Black excellence, and Black students being discouraged from attending university. These are issues they face that does not begin in high school, but have their origins in elementary school and carry on into university. What we are dealing with at root and fundamentally is systemic anti-Black racism. We're very fortunate today to have a powerhouse panel of diverse South Asian speakers who are fighting against anti-Black racism. There are students, staff, and activists and teachers coming together for today's webinar. While we all share South Asian identity, which is to bring us together in solidarity, what's important to note is that we are aware as to where we sit on the spectrum of the South Asian diaspora with respect to overlapping discriminatory factors such as our caste, gender, sexuality, economic class, culture, politics, religion, and region. We don't have all the voices of our South Asian community, and we do not speak for everyone who identifies as being part of the South Asian diaspora. The goal of this session today is to invite everyone to the space that is inclusive and will enable us all to seek and unpack our South Asian complicity challenges and strategies for allyship amongst educators and students in the class environment, along with parents, to foster racial solidarity and confront anti-Black racism in education. I encourage all of you to ask any questions throughout this session via the chat, and we will try our very best to answer them. It is my honor to now introduce our speakers for this evening, who will share more about themselves with respect to their positionality and their present work. First, we have Julius, who's an elementary teacher in the Toronto District School Board and was featured in Shri Paradkar's article in the Toronto Star, Who Can Use the N-Word? Who Stands for O Canada, and her woes over equity work. Welcome, Julius.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight. My name's Julius. I go by they, them pronouns. A bit about myself. I'm a first-generation immigrant from Kerala, India, middle class, non-binary, queer, fat, and disabled. In terms of caste, which I think is always important to position myself in when interacting in South Asian spaces, I'm culturally a Syro-Malabar Christian from Kerala. And while that does mean my family does not have a specific caste title, historically, many Syro-Malabar Christians have benefited greatly as privileged minorities in Kerala. And I'm sharing my positionality to stress the voice that I speak for first and foremost, which is myself. And I don't represent all racialized queer bodies or people. And the knowledge that I'm really bringing into this space today is as a BIPOC elementary educator who has positioned myself in challenging privilege and policies in my school board. And I'm also bringing the lens of a master's student who's exploring the creation, application, and the accountability that's sometimes lacking in equity policy in Ontario.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Vidya Shah, who is assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at York University. Welcome, Vidya.
Thank you so much, Ananya, and thank you to the entire network for the invitation today. I'm excited to be in conversation with such a dynamic panel. I identify as a second-generation South Asian woman, half East Indian, half West Indian. My mother from Trinidad and Tobago. Ancestors came from India as indentured servants. My father was born in Zanzibar, East Africa, and his family immigrated to Zanzibar from India for business, and then came here, left Zanzibar because of the revolution, and came here to Canada. I identify as half Brahmin, which is my mom's side, and half Jain, which is my father's side, which is the Baniya caste. I identify as a colonized settler on these lands, and I'm always in thought and in conversation and in action around what it means to be a settler on these lands. I identify as somebody that struggles with mental health. I identify as somebody that is taken by Eastern spiritualities, but I also identify as a cisgender, straight, able-bodied university professor in a faculty of education. I identify as middle class, and I identify as not being marginalized by accent discrimination. And I think that's an important part of when we think about the experiences of being South Asian. So all of these complex identities inform my work, my commitments to anti-Black racism in the classroom, in my activism, and in life in general. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we have Vaquita Putt, who is an elementary teacher in the Peel District School Board. Hi, Vaquita.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much for putting this event together. I'm so honored to be with all these amazing folks on this panel. I identify as a first-generation immigrant whose caste is Brahmin, so I come with a lot of privilege in my positionality, and I'm a fifth-year middle school educator. And I don't think that we can start this conversation until I locate myself first within the settler colonial project in Canada. I was born in Mississauga, Ontario, land belonging to and part of the Mississauga First Nation. I grew up extremely ignorant of my roots as a racialized settler on this land because of the education system that I was in and currently teach in now. Histories of colonization, slavery, genocide, anti-Black racism, white supremacy, and Indigenous relations to land were unknown to me as I went from being a student to an educator. And who I am as a racialized settler and what it means to be complicit in settler colonialism and white supremacy came not through the education system, even though I did my master's at OISE. And my program did give me context, but it came from community. I took part in student activism, got involved in my students' union, and in organizations such as No One is Illegal. But speaking of my limitations, even through my activist work, I've come to realize that my identity is and always will be fraught with contradictions. So when talking about my limitations, for instance, I critique systems, or we all do, we're all on this panel critiquing systems of power, yet we benefit from them by our very presence as educators or as folks that are participating within the education system. I'm able to own land, and yet the purchase of land lends to the further colonization of Indigenous nations. I demand citizenship rights for racialized people, and yet through my demands, I'm reifying the legitimacy of the Canadian nation state. So these contradictions from my identity and my relationship to the land as a racialized person are fraught with contradiction. And so because of my unease at living in such sites of contradictions, and also what I keep telling myself, that's why I'm in education and hoping to use it as a tool for decolonization and dismantling white supremacy. So hopefully that happens one day.
Together, hopefully. Next, we have Hona Mevi. She is a former student trustee for Hamilton Wentworth District School Board and now at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Hona. I think you're on. Hona, we can't hear you.
Okay.
Oh no. Oh. No.
Oh, I think she's coming.
Can you hear it?
Yeah, you can hear you. Awesome.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Well, hi everyone, and thank you to South Asian Allyship Network for having me. I am really honored to be here on a panel to have a discussion among a lot of people who are actually my role models. It's great to be having this discussion with you guys. And so I am a second generation Bengali. I was born in Canada, but I am the daughter to two Bengali immigrants who moved here in the 1990s. And so I do want to acknowledge my privilege, obviously, as a South Asian person, but also as someone who isn't necessarily, it doesn't identify as Black or Indigenous, obviously. And so I also want to acknowledge the fact that I am from Hamilton, which is traditional Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe land, covered by the dish with one spoon, the covenant. And so what I want to acknowledge with that as well is the fact
Difficulties. Okay, my apologies to the audience. We are having some technical difficulties. Thank you for your patience. We hopefully will have Hona come back very soon. But I think in the meantime, I'm going to see if we could bring in our next guest speaker, Austin, who's pursuing his French as second language teacher candidate in the B.Ed program at York University. Welcome, Austin.
Hi, and thank you all so much for inviting me here. I'm so excited to have this conversation tonight. My name is Austin Jaffrey. I identify I'm not South Asian. I'm actually Indo-Caribbean. So my parents are Guyanese, and I was born here in Canada. And I'm working class, able-bodied, cisgendered, and was born in Toronto. And for me, I think this conversation is super important. I have about 5 years of teaching experience running a French homework club in public libraries. I grew up in a neighborhood of Malvern in Toronto where there's a high concentrated population of Black folks. My family, actually half my family is Black, so my cousins are Black. So I can be able to speak to some of the experiences they told me that they've been through in the education system as well. And I acknowledge my brown privilege that I have, especially as a cisgendered male. So I'm super excited to be here, and I can definitely talk about some of my classroom practices where I've actually created a unit on Black Lives Matter when I was volunteering for the COVID-19 emergency remote teaching back in the springtime. So I can definitely talk about that as well.
Awesome. Thank you. So thanks to all our speakers. I really hope everyone in our audience really took this as a learning opportunity for you to all come back and really look at all the different identities you hold and how it creates more privilege for you, and be able to use this privilege and power constructively to really work with the communities that are marginalized, and for us here on this panel, for our Black communities in the education spaces. We're going to hopefully have Hona join us shortly. We are going to, though, delve in to this conversation collectively. And so our first part of the segment is really going to be talking about enablers and barriers that are Black students in the Ontario education system are facing historically and to this day. Given that everyone had the opportunity to really frame their positionality, really understanding the privilege that they hold collectively, my question is, how are you all using this privilege when working with Black students? How can, as all of you, as being part of the South Asian diaspora, as educators and students, can avoid co-opting or misplacing our experiences as the same as our Black students? And to start, I pass it to Julius first as our youngest teacher on this panel.
Thank you. So for myself, when I think of my position, I always start by thinking about myself historically, because I bring all of that into my experiences. And so when I consider how many South Indian folks, especially, are brought into equity knowledge, we come with a very strong experience of shadeism, especially from being from the South and having very strong Dravidian roots. And so that experience of shadeism sometimes it becomes a stumbling block when we engage in equity work, because we start to align ourselves with Black experiences and Black narratives, even though those are not our stories. And so I find it's very crucial to remind folks that it's not our struggle, and we cannot equate it with that because of our experiences with shadeism. However, we have to also keep in mind that even though we might have experienced bullying or discrimination in Canada or back home, that our experiences of racism for skin color are totally different than what our students have experienced. Experiencing that kind of oppression generationally and for an extended period of time in a wide variety of sectors is very different than experiencing it as one generation living in a diaspora community. And so as part of that, I always find it's also important to reflect on our historical role in maintaining imperialism and colonialism, especially in terms of British rule in India and the ways in which the British almost prepared certain parts of the Indian population to maintain that colonial project and that imperial project. In terms of Brahmin folks or people who are higher caste, being allowed to go to British colleges, British institutions, and to come back essentially as brown folks with deeply internalized narratives of colonialism and what is right and wrong, and a sense of a self-harming perception of their own communities. And so in many ways, we end up being the middle managers of racism is how I think of it. And we end up in these roles where there's a lot of gray space for us to do harm or to do a lot of good. And quite often I find the leadership model that we end up falling into is one where we close the door firmly behind us because we're so eager to protect that imperialism and that colonial history. And so because of that, I find it's very important for us to not just be social justice oriented, but to be willing to step back and to not treat it like a resume booster. And so, I find myself constantly having to check myself because opportunities come knocking at the door because I'm more of a presentable face, or I check off enough boxes without being too Black, without being too Indigenous. And so it's really important for me in those moments to have to say no. And, it's hard because I'm so conditioned to think I must succeed. And if equity is what I'm going to do, then I have to be the biggest equity person. But the reality is our work sometimes needs to be more quiet leadership, especially in the spaces. And as teachers, it can look like a wide range of things. And so I'm going to stop there and hopefully add on as the other folks on the panel share their thoughts as well.
So what really stood out to me is how you're talking about the concept of quiet leadership. And, often when we think about activism and advocacy work, it's really, putting us in a position where we feel we have that privilege and our power to constructively amplify our voices on behalf of, our Black students. Actually, I'm going to ask Vidya, based on, your years of experience, being a professor, teaching about this, what are your thoughts about, what it means to have quiet leadership?
I just want to say ditto to everything that Julius just said. I think there's a really fine line between using your voice to amplify issues that need to be amplified, to stand in solidarity, to stand with, to stand behind Black and Indigenous communities as South Asian people. But there's a really fine line between that and the performativity of this work. And it's, if one of the things I ask myself personally all the time is if I need to tweet about everything that I'm doing, if I need to tell the world about everything that I'm doing, then I'm not doing it for the right reasons. If I need to get kudos or acknowledgement for this work, then it's about me. It's not about the actual work. And so if we aren't risking in this work, if we aren't diverting funds into this work, if we aren't diverting time and energy into this work that isn't being spoken about publicly, then I think that we are complicit in the project of white supremacy. And so how we engage this work is so much more about it's about being really conscious of when we're using our voice for these types of initiatives and when we need to just quietly go and do and be in service of and close our mouths and just do. And so I think about this, it's related to this idea, and Julia spoke about this as well, but this idea of South Asians being in a gray space. And I think about the work of Dr. Vinay Harpalani, who is a critical race theorist, and he speaks about South Asians being racially ambiguous. And so what he says is that in this place of ambiguity, in part because of in political ways in terms of what box do we fill out on the census form, and in part because of how some of us pass as white or as some other race. He talks about the fact that we're both kind of given a racial ascription. So people talk about us in certain ways. So as terrorists or as foreigners or, with all of these labels. But he says that we also claim racial ascription through, trying to access wealth or trying to access social capital or aspiring to whiteness. And we're in this really interesting position as South Asians. And we need to be conscious of the racial makeup of how this came to be historically, how the model minority myth came to be historically, and think about, delve into that learning, really delve into that learning, and think about how we have been constructed as a model minority specifically to justify further oppression of Blacks and Indigenous people of these lands. And if we don't recognize that larger piece, and we're only thinking about, as Julius was saying, sort of the pain and harm that we've experienced, and we're not seeing the histories that exist here and the contemporary ways that racism plays out in particular ways for Black people and for Indigenous people that do not apply to South Asian people, then we are complicit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think the history piece is something that we really need to embed into our curriculums, and again, not having that one lecture on Black history, but really keep it as a strong thread throughout the curriculum in all disciplines and in all courses. We have Hona back. Thank you. Welcome. I just want to reintroduce Hona. She is a former student trustee for the Hamilton Wentworth District Board, and now with the University of Toronto. Given the conversation that we're having, Hona, I would love to hear, from your perspective as a student, understanding that, our educational system is designed to limit the success of Black students. And you're obviously, and all of us here are very aware of how the system is actually designed to enhance us to be more successful in the education system. Can you talk about, some of the struggles that you've seen, sitting on the board when trying to, increase the inclusion and recognition of Black students to succeed and see their full potential?
For sure. So, sitting on the Board of Trustees within Hamilton this year, it was made very clear to me that Black students are not prioritized within the board and within the education system in general. And so, considering the fact that the Board of Trustees has 12 trustees, only 4 of them are racialized and none of them are Black. So it's very interesting to see the fact that the people making high-level decisions regarding policy, which is going to be affecting the education, the safety, and the lives of Black students within the board, the people making the decisions regarding their lives and their outcomes are actually people who don't understand their lived experience and who don't kind of have the empathy to be able to try to understand their lived experiences in general. And so on the board, that's something that I found extremely disturbing, but that's kind of the tip of the iceberg, considering the fact that a lot of these trustees are actually overtly and explicitly racist. And so, and that's something that I outlined within my experience. I had heard a trustee use the N-word in reference to Serena Williams. When we were trying to get cops out of schools, I had, heard trustees saying that, police voices matter and trying to kind of demean and disregard the experiences of violence with police that Black students had. And so these are the conversations that are happening around the board table, and these are the people who are voting on what is going to be happening within our schools. And so that's extremely disturbing. And so, and when we're looking at kind of confronting this, these exact people are the ones who are going to be deciding whether or not their own acts are racist, right? So it's very difficult when, there actually is no Black voice at the board. And that's among the Board of Trustees and among senior staff as well. So it's definitely extremely disturbing.
Does anybody want to kind of follow up on, Ahona's experience seeing your students in the classroom, particularly perhaps those who are South Asian, trying to work alongside their Black students?
I'd love to add something, if that's okay.
Please do.
For me, when I read your story, Hona, what really touched me was how candidly you were breaking that toxic culture of silence that often comes with positions of power in Canada. And behind closed doors, I've heard so many stories of organizations that should be doing great work, that are doing the complete opposite and are in fact causing even more harm and generational harm to Black students and Indigenous students as well. And so I admire that in your process, but I also think that's a space that more South Asian people need to take up, because in that gray space that we're in, we get access into those spaces. And how often do we just sit there in complicity and in silence to protect ourselves? I've been guilty of that. I have sat in those spaces and worried for my employment more than the fact that my students are going to be affected for years to come. And so it wasn't until I had mentors who were kind of nudging me to take that step and to speak boldly that I felt that I could. But it also took stepping away from the capitalist notions that are ingrained to us as quote unquote model minorities, because we're always fighting to maintain that status. And especially in a community that's as tightly woven as South Asian communities are, there's even more pressure to maintain family legacy by extension. And so to go your own way and to speak your own truth in many ways is to quite literally go your own way away from your community. And so, how do we start creating that momentum towards that so that speaking out becomes the norm, and to choose to be complicit in that violence ostracizes you from your community, because we can't have people perpetuating that harm while creating their myths of individual success when that is not the case.
Thank you. Yeah, sure, Vaquita.
Yeah, can I speak to this? I was just gonna echoing what Julius said. This idea of neutrality and neutral spaces and education being, quote unquote neutral is I think a problem that we need to interrogate as well. When I think of the reason why the education system was created in Canada as we know it today, it was essentially created to limit the success of Black and Indigenous students. And that's just the truth. So the last residential school closed in 1996, and the last segregated school closed in 1983. So essentially, where do we go from here if the system itself was built on a strategy to erase and oppress, right? And the only way, I think, is what the two speakers ahead of me said, is to speak out and not be silent in our privilege, right? So one avenue that some boards, and I'm going to speak about the appeal board a little bit, but one avenue that some boards have taken, and it's not just boards, it's all organizations. Like, I'm sure that all of us have experienced organizations, companies, academic institutions, governments that will say, okay, let's gather some data and let's write a report. And that is like the go-to for institutions in this white supremacist structure. And the appeal board is no different. So there was a report that came out in 2020, and it's not the first time that anti-Black racism was raised as an issue in the Peel District School Board. Back in 2016, PDSB itself released a report called We Rise Together. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with it. And it documented anti-Black racism within the board. And the report spoke about Black students being disproportionately pushed towards applied courses versus academic. It spoke to like the isolation that Black students feel in school, and there's a lot more, and I encourage everybody to read it. The 2020 report, which might I add was like only commissioned because of the advocacy of Black students and parents who invested time, energy, and emotional labor of holding the board accountable. And I think that's another thing. It's like nobody is waiting for South Asian people to advocate, right? There are movements occurring right now that we can join, that we can add our voice to, but I guess it's nobody's waiting for us. There are movements that are already happening that have shown great success. We need to now do something, right? With this privilege that we hold, this like marginal, we're living in the margins, but we need to kind of like we need to join in, and we need to do more with the proximity to whiteness that we have. And so some examples that came out of the 2020 report, and I know I'm going a little long, so I'm going to be quick, is that Black students are only 10.2% of the secondary school population, but approximately 22.5% of students receiving suspensions. And principals really had no like oversight. There was no accountability. Or there isn't still. So out of 18 choices on why you would suspend a student, the 18th option is other. And the report found that in 78% of secondary school suspensions, the reason listed was other. And I think that is the issue, because companies, boards, governments, et cetera, issuing reports without tangible action means that nothing really changes in the system. When there is like an ability, power, and capacity to make change, but there's no will, nothing will change. And so when we're looking at South Asian and Indo-Caribbean community in the Peel District School Board specifically, and granted, 67% of teachers are white, but the next largest racial group is South Asian, Indo-Caribbean, 16%. We're at 16%. So the fact that we're represented as educators in leadership positions and as educators in the classroom, we need to do something with that power and that complicity that we hold with white supremacy. So I think that's sort of the way I look at it, that we really don't need any more reports. We actually need to do the work. The work is being done. We need to join in on that work.
Thank you so much, Vaquita. We were going to talk about the report by the Peel District School Board, so you answered one of our questions. Thank you for that. But I really like that point you made, the fact that Black students, parents, faculty, administrators have begun this work like a long, long time ago, right? And what they're really looking for is us, who hold more privilege in this artificial racial hierarchy that has been created, to join forces, right? And to really be able to amplify all of our voices together, and just, as you said, to join in and do the work that is absolutely important. I think what I wanted to highlight is, as many of us that are represented in education as, South Asian and Indo-Caribbean folks, is that, there are many people who are part of our communities who are in power. For example, Peter Joshua, who was fired by the Ministry of Education because of his lack of ability to address decades of anti-Black racism, and Black folks and accomplices have welcomed this change, as many believe that he was complicit in so many problematic practices. How can we as Brown educators and people in positions of power from South Asian diaspora and from the Indo-Caribbean communities be accountable for people who are part of our communities having these problematic behaviors in addressing anti-Black racism? And I would love Austin to actually start us off.
Sure. So what I think we have to do is we need to call it out. We need to be blunt. We need to be frank. This is not about, protecting people's feelings or sugarcoating anything. We need to call it out, and we need to hold people accountable. For example, just yesterday, my grandmother was watching TV, and something on TV came out with a Black girl, and she was talking about her hair, and she was talking about racism. And then my grandma was like, oh, racist, racist, racist. All these people want to do is talk about racism. Everything is racist today. So then I challenged her and I said, well, actually, it is racist. And then she automatically said, she's like, oh, well, we also went through racism too. It's not just Black people. I said, yes, we do have our own struggles. However, it's not, nearly as bad as what Black and Indigenous people have gone through. And then she challenged me on that. She said, well, I don't believe that we have privilege. I'm like, yes, we do. Do you think anybody would pet your hair because your hair is straight? And then she got silent. And then I said, I have friends in elementary and secondary school where literally people would be petting their hair. So when I challenged her on that, then she got quiet. And then I said, we need to address these racist systems. And then we had a conversation about, she's a caretaker in the TDSB. We had a conversation around racism in schools. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to have these courageous conversations. We are complicit in white supremacy and the colonial project if we don't say anything and if we turn a blind eye to it. We need to address it.
So anyone want to comment on this about how do we confront our people who are part of our communities who are creating problems and perpetuating racism?
Yeah, I'll jump in
Yeah,
here,
thank you.
Ananya, if that's okay. I want to, I want to name how important this piece around silence is, institutional silence. The premise of the white supremacist system is that it exists in silence, it exists in denial, it exists in ignorance, it exists in I think it was what Vaquita or maybe Julius was saying about the stalling and like the let's collect more data, let's consult more people. It exists in these systems. And the other thing is that it hires for whiteness, right? It hires people in the institutions that are going to align with whiteness. And if you are not aligning with whiteness, then you are going to be harmed and your job is at risk. And there are many leaders that are sort of, in higher positions that are pushing back against that. But it is an extremely white supremacist system that protects and promotes this alignment to white logics and harms people that go against that. And so I completely agree with Austin that our role as people that have experienced some levels of racism in positions of power is that we need to use that awareness and we need to use those experiences as fuel to speak back to these white supremacist systems that are demanding of us institutional silence and denial and ignorance. And if we don't do that, we are complicit in it. I also want to name that there are many white directors of education that don't get named as being extremely racist. And part of this system is to name the racialized people that are enacting whiteness and to not name the white people that are expected to enact whiteness. And in no way am I saying that I'm letting people off the hook for not being very bold and very strong against anti-Black racism, against anti-Indigenous racism, but thinking about the larger mechanisms at play here and how complex it is that we are socialized into whiteness. We are expected to align to whiteness the higher up we go. And at the same time, we don't call out other people, right? And so it's such a complex system. And there's also absolutely no excuse. If you aren't a leader that's willing to lead boldly and courageously and take risks, even if that means it's going to impact your employment, then you're not ready to be a leader. And I would offer that 90% of the people in leadership positions right now who are not able to do that are not equipped to be leaders. They don't have the competency necessary to be leaders of the systems that are protecting children.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about, since we're, talking about, this white supremacy, system that, upholds our education system in Ontario. There's been a lot of conversations and a lot of data also, looking at, the role of school resource officers. And campus police and other cops on school, including security guards. And it's been an area of concern because, many students who are non-Black feel, they feel safe having this, police or enforcement presence. But there's data clearly showing that, Black students in particular don't feel safe around them. And it does create a lot of trauma that's obviously deeply rooted in their histories. I just wanted to hear from your experiences, in the schools that you're working with, what is the process? Like, I know it's been temporarily on hold, for example, in the Peel region to have school resource officers and other district school boards. They've been eliminated. Just wanted to hear some of your comments and your thoughts about this. And welcome back, Austin.
Could I start?
Yes,
That's okay. So I believe in the TDSB, the program has been removed. And yet in most of the schools I've been in, which are in very low income, traditionally, or I would say tend to be highly Black and Indigenous communities, you will still find police officers in schools. And it's not because of policy, it's because of admin often. And those relationships they're pulling on and the significance of what a police officer in a school represents to these students. And so I often found in the schools that I was in that police officers would just be walking around with the admin, not doing anything other than chatting, but the effect of that as a queer person especially was jarring. I would feel anxious. My students would feel anxious. And so often I would just close the door. If an officer came in, I would just say, I'm so sorry, we're doing something really important. Could you come later? And close the door. To which, my admin's face was not great, but I'm not putting my kids through that. And as long as they're in my room, they're not doing that. I've been in presentations where a resource officer, well, not officially a resource officer, but a community officer, felt comfortable calling students by name for things that she had arrested them for in an assembly. And no other staff member was upset. And it took me having to go dig and dig and dig to find out that my admin had written the notes for that presentation. And so it's jarring to see how certain administrators are violating the policies and actually doing what they want to do, knowing historically what those officers represent and symbolize these communities. And so I do feel as South Asian educators, sometimes we have to be willing to shut our doors and take a little bit of cold shoulder for the week, if that's what it means to protect our kids. But it also meant when I got back in the room with those students, telling them explicitly, the cop may have said, don't record, you need to record. The cop may have said, don't call your parents, you need to call your parents. And so sometimes it's having those upfront conversations, informing students, and engaging in what some folks might call being political in the classroom, because it's not being political. With their lives, it is quite seriously protecting their lives and keeping them safe outside of school when they're not so fortunate to be around their teachers or parents who know that they're only children.
Vaquita, did you want to maybe talk about your experience, given that SROs are right now being temporarily paused in the Peel region?
Yeah, so the Peel program has been put on pause for community consultation, and I go like this because the short answer is that there's there is no point to this consultation, in my opinion, because as I said, we have the data, we know the truth, we just need to really just put it into action. But again, it's a stalling technique that organizations use to sort of stall the process, essentially. So so essentially what it looks like is that there seems to be no movement since the announcement in Peel. No public consultations have been announced. And as educators, we haven't received any notice of consultations. The Peel Police committed to consult with the Black Community Action Network of Peel, which has been one of the stakeholders leading the fight against anti-Black racism in PDSB and Moyo Community Health Services. And the PDSB also has committed to launching their own consultations once this new program is announced to see if it's a good fit. But essentially, the way I look at it, and I know Hona will probably speak more to this because the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board is just amazing. Like the activism that you folks have done is amazing. But what I find is that we need to put public pressure when it comes to issues like this, because with consultations and with like institutional reports, what ends up happening is that momentum is lost. And that's what they're banking on. And so, for instance, when we emailed and tried to get more information from the Peel Police, quote unquote, this is an email, it is difficult to put an exact timeline on when the report is anticipated, and I would not want to commit to a date and not see it as expected. Once the report is available for public viewing, we will certainly make it available. Thank you. And so this is the issue. This is where the Black community cannot keep the momentum going. It is not just their responsibility. And I think it is our responsibility. It always has been our responsibility to also, be a part of this this fight against the SRO program, but broadly, perhaps even having discussions about defunding the police and looking at reallocating to community resources. And so it is, the work is being done, but it's not on the Black community to continue that work. And unfortunately, a lot of the emotional labor does fall on the Black community. And so one of the things that I would, really urge all the viewers, but even I know all the folks in this panel are doing this too, but doing that work, doing the work alongside.
Thank you. Hona, I would love to hear your perspective from a student and, an incredible work that you've been part of at the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board.
Yeah, for sure. So I work alongside a coalition of Black and racialized organizers in Hamilton called HWDSB Kids Need Help. And this organization, primarily led by Black Muslim women, has been advocating for the removal of the police liaison program from HWDSB schools for about 4 years now. And so the police liaison program got terminated on June 22nd of this year, which is a huge win. It's a huge victory. It's historical actually. And so I really think that the organizers within this coalition, they've hosted town halls, they've done consultations with students, we've collected hundreds of testimonials from students directly. And yet, when this was brought forward to the trustees, to the director, to senior staff at HWDSB, it was deemed that this was invalid data, and that in order for us to have real concrete evidence that this program is in fact racist, there needed to be research done by the board directly. And this, honestly, it made absolutely no sense to us, considering the fact that board officials have no lived experience with police in schools. They do not have the lived experience of being Black, Indigenous, or racialized students. And so, it also comes with the fact that in the TDSB, after the police liaison program was terminated, suspensions and expulsions for all students, especially Black and Indigenous students, they went down astronomically, right? So we saw a 24% decrease in suspensions in 1 year, and a 53% decrease in expulsion in 1 year. And so that speaks volumes, as well as the fact that, students had come forward with stories about being carded in their own hallways. These are Black students specifically, being wrongfully targeted and, accused of drug possession. We've seen students as young as primary school and elementary school being handcuffed and placed in the back of police cruisers. And we've seen, disabled students experience this as well. And these are primarily Black, Indigenous, and racialized students who came forward with these experiences. So it was a long fight, and it was a very, very difficult battle. Even if any of you want to listen back on the June 22nd board meeting where there was a termination, as I said, there were trustees saying, police voices matter. Why aren't we listening to specific groups? Why are we only listening to specific groups of students, implying that they're talking about Black students? And so the conversation kept going back to the fact that, like trustees were saying, I've been in schools where I've seen my students play basketball with police officers. So I feel like, this program is really beneficial. So it really speaks volumes that trustees kind of value white students playing basketball with police liaison officers over the dignity and the safety and the protection of Black, Indigenous, and racialized students. So it is definitely a difficult fight to, pursue removing police from schools, but it's something that needs to happen for the protection and the dignity of Black students.
Thank you so much, Hona. I mean, I'm really glad we were able to share that story from your perspective, because it also just shows again and reinforces the importance of us together, as non-Black racialized folks working in solidarity, right, with our Black students, and to make sure that they are treated with most respect and that they're able to come to a safe learning environment. And I really hope, the story that you shared will really inspire other young, students like yourself, whether in high school or, entering university, to really think of ways how they can really work alongside with their Black students. So thank you so much for sharing that story. Just to continue on this conversation about SROs, I just wanted to ask Austin, you've had direct experience with an SRO as well. You've, heard about the experiences from your cousins. Can you share that with us?
Sure. So when I was in grade 9, my school was in Melbourne, and we were the very first extended French class to be a feeder school at Agincourt. And so at Agincourt, it's in a predominantly middle class neighborhood. So I had to take the bus to high school. And when I was in grade 9, I got into an argument with an Asian girl about food and nutrition. It was so stupid, like it's high school argument. She said that students who take food and nutrition are dumb and business students are smarter. And I love food and nutrition. That was my thing. So anyways, I had like an argument with her in the hallway saying that you shouldn't say that about people who took food and nutrition. And my friend put his hand on the locker. And now she went and blew up the story to the vice principal. And little did I know, the next week I was called to the office 4 times with the SRO in the office with handcuffs. And they were threatening to kick me out of Agincourt and send me to another school because I was a guest from another school, because I didn't come from the school directly across the street. And they were threatening to kick me out of the school because I don't represent Agincourt values. And it was just really traumatic. It was weird for me to be in an office with a police officer, a white male police officer standing there giving me the death stare while my vice principal lectured me about behavior, when all I did was say that you shouldn't say that students are dumb for taking food and nutrition. And I was called to the office 4 times that week. Even my teachers were confused as to why I was getting in trouble about that. And they went through camera footage and everything, and they saw that I and my friend, like, we did not pose any threat to her. So they eventually dropped it, but we didn't get any apology. So I have that experience with my direct experience as a brown person. Now I can only imagine if I were Black, what they would have done. They would have probably suspended me, kicked me out of the school, who knows? And my cousin, who is Black, he went to Cedarbrae, and he was telling me how when he finished from the pool after gym class or something, he was walking to his locker and his eyes were red because, with chlorine from the pool, it often makes your eyes red. So his eyes were red, and he told me that the SRO stopped him in the hallway and stripped him and searched him for weed and accused him of having weed. He didn't have any on him, but that experience was traumatic. So these are just, my experience is not even as bad as what a Black person has to face on a daily basis with these SROs. And just to point out, when I was reading earlier that the Peel District School Board put their SRO on hold, I kind of want to correct that. I want to put the Peel District School Board should abolish the SRO program.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to move on to talking about parents. Something that I personally struggle with often is, as much as we are, advocating within, our education spaces that we're part of, and, we're trying to really, rope in, our South Asian students, to be allies, to be accomplices, to really delve in and do that work in terms of understanding the histories of their Black peers and, work alongside them. I always worry when they come home, they're getting a contradictory message, from their parents. And I think, we can all see, when, the uprise of the BLM movement had started in the summer, as a result of, George Floyd's death and Regis Porchinsky, and even right now, seeing the decision that was made in court, against Breonna Taylor's death. I think we can all agree that, often, South Asian parents say, well, Black students, they just don't work as hard as our South Asian students do, right? That they're, it's part of their culture, perhaps, to not succeed. And I find South Asian students are kind of like in this battle zone, right? And it's not that they want to be influenced by their parents. I'm sure there's a lot of resistance to it. As Austin shared, about his story with his grandmother. how can we change the narrative for South Asian parents? So, South Asian students aren't coming home and listening to the exact opposite message that all of you as educators are sharing and advocating for. Does anybody want to start us off? Vidya?
I kind of had a feeling it was coming to me. I think there's so many things that that South Asian parents can do, and I think one of the most important things to realize is that as South Asians, we were not taught, intentionally not taught, about our place in this racial hierarchy. And that was by design. And so I think for a lot of South Asian parents, they don't know where to begin with these conversations because we intentionally were not taught these things. And you know, I think about the importance of parents educating themselves alongside their children, and this becoming an opportunity again to dive deep into issues of race, and not just our own experiences of race. That might be a starting point, our own experiences of being racialized as South Asian people, as Indo-Caribbean people, but also then thinking about how that fits into a much larger picture. And again, if we're not bringing history into this, if we're not looking at differences in how folks experience housing and the justice system and child welfare and education, if we're not looking at all of the manifestations of anti-Black racism now in our society, then we're not getting a full picture. And so I would suggest that for parents, it's about reading and learning and sharing, having conversations with your children, being conscious of comments that we make about, as Julius was saying, shadeism, and comments that we make that attribute, beauty and value based on skin color. I think it's important that we are having conversations with children about, the importance of thinking about the appropriation of Black culture and what that means, and how hard it is to be in this in-between ambiguous phase of South Asians, where we don't often have, people that we can look to in the media that look like us or that represent our realities, and so we align one way or the other. But having those conversations and having the conversation about the need for greater representation, as opposed to thinking about cultural appropriation, being thoughtful about messages and what we say about who we can be friends with, who our young people can marry, who they can date, it really being thoughtful about all the ways that the messaging that comes out is part of that. And I think when we think about how we help children understand the differences in experience, when we really understand those differences in experience, there's going to be much less of that, well, we did it, why can't they do it? Why can't they just, do this like we've done, put their head down, work hard like we've done, because we understand in a historical and in a contemporary way the massive differences that exist between the two races.
Thank you. Does anybody like to add on to what Vidya said? Yeah, Julius?
So I just want to add on to a few things Vidya already said. When I think especially of our cultural familial interactions, there's often a lot of teasing and ragging that goes on, and it's kind of like a way of showing love between family. And so I often find that the language can be so derogatory, right? Like in my own language, saying Karambi all the time to like describe darkness. And, if you go out for the sun in the sun too long, that becomes your nickname for the rest of the afternoon. And so, I personally don't have children, but the students that I parent, I would say, especially my South Asian girls that I find tend to gravitate towards me. Sometimes it's breaking down those conversations internally and saying it vocally. And so sometimes for me, I'll say, we're going out for, 3 hours in the sun. I'm feeling nervous because what I'm thinking in my head is what my mom would say, which is wear a ton of sunscreen, make sure you wear a giant hat and you sit in the shade and you're fully dressed from head to toe. And I tell them once we're outside, I'm like, doesn't it feel so good on your skin? Doesn't it just feel so nice to sit in the warmth and to not have to hide who we are and to just enjoy our melanin? And so these are conversations that don't even just have to happen around my South Asian kids, but even my Black girls, they love hearing those conversations where I'm affirming the beauty of something that normally gets shut down at home. And so I find, sometimes kids may not find that at home. And especially for me as someone who's not a parent at all, I find that for perhaps this next generation of South Asian kids, we're going to be the one teaching our parents. I end up having a lot of conversations with my parents where, when I came out, their biggest concern was, what do we tell people now? And, my mom is like, it'd be easier to tell them you're unemployed than the fact that you're queer. And so things like that, where it's like, no, you can just say it. And me being on family video camp, just saying it. And everyone back home is like, what is that word? And so little things like that. And then bringing in the historical perspective, I find a lot of folks who are in the similar position as me, or at least in the position of educating their parents, end up teaching our parents the histories that they were never taught. And so for me, that's a lot of teaching my parents queer histories of Kerala. And they're like, well, I remember that news story. I thought it was just this, which was like a suicide, perhaps, right? And so, and then I have to be like, well, no, actually, that was actually a queer act of resistance when people were being forced into arranged marriages, and lesbian couples would commit suicide together, and news stories would just frame it as independent stories that had nothing to do with queerness. And so, when you start sharing those narratives that they have or stories they have and linking them to the oppressions that, we are experiencing here in a different diaspora experience, it's easier for them, but it's a constant ongoing challenge. And we have to do the work to shift that window of understanding to where it needs to be so that they're ready for action.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Julius. Vaquita?
Sorry, I just wanted to say, so I'm going to kind of build, so doing that one-on-one conversations, knowing our history is so important. And then also dismantling like this myth that we have, that we're the creators of our own success. And I hear that a lot within our own communities, that we work hard, et cetera, because that's a very capitalist, and I think I can't not talk about capitalism in a way when we're talking about racism, and so I'm kind of gonna do all of it together. So when I'm thinking about when communities, especially like South Asian Indo-Caribbean communities, are talking about our own success, it's because white supremacy literally allows us to succeed. The immigration system did not fall out of the sky, fully formed. Every rule in the system was intentional. And again, one thing is that no system is neutral, and it is always designed to support and protect the white supremacist project in Canada, which is erasure of Black and Indigenous folks, their history, and the work that they've done to really allow space for us to come and immigrate here. And so we were allowed to move to this country through the point system that favors class and caste. So there's a certain class and caste of South Asian Indo-Caribbean folks that have immigrated here as well. So I think that's an important point to note as well.
Thank you so much for sharing. There's a lot we can cover, and I know I love this segment of our conversation just because, I think it's so important, for us thinking about our parents and, how far or not they've come along, in, the anti-Black racism movement. But I wanted to move on to strategies because I think it's really important that, we have our audience take away and thinking about action. And so I wanted to touch upon, how do we as Brown educators, continue to create space in our learning environments for Black students, parents, and community members. So Austin?
Cool. So I guess for me, what's super important is culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. In the FSL context, there is no reason for French teachers to be using books written in the 1900s by old white men and making students memorize grammar, because that seems to be like something teachers love to do. Include Blackness in every aspect of your curriculum. In French, we have this thing called intercultural awareness. So it's recognition of our own culture and of other cultures. Don't have students just do a superficial research project where you ask them to write about, the music, the food, the fashion of a certain Francophone country. Have courageous conversations. Anti-oppression work that involves courageous conversations, it means digging deeper, going beyond the surface level. Why do educators leave out colonization and linguistic imperialism? That's a great entry point as to why we even speak French. French is a colonial language. So I feel like we need to look at culture and diversity through an anti-oppressive lens. And as well, we need to deconstruct stereotypes. So talk about what the angry Black girl is. Talk about the basketball player. Talk about these stereotypes in your class. Use that power and that privilege you have as a teacher to talk about these social justice issues in your class. When I was doing volunteer teaching for the COVID emergency remote unit learning, I tossed out my plans for June and I created a whole unit on Black Lives Matter. And I explained to my students, I first started off talking about my brown privilege, that I do not represent Black people nor their lived experiences, but I can take a step back and look at it and look at what's going on. And I had my students analyze the BLM principles on the BLM website, and I had them connect those principles to their own community, whether that be religious, whatever it may be. And then I had them also do some research on the movement and on the oppression of Black folks throughout history. And then I also, the final part of the unit, mini unit, was to have them move from talking about it and research to actually action, to doing something about it. So I had them describe what they will do to be an active accomplice and an ally to uplift Black folks. And I feel like teachers need to insert Blackness into their curriculum. They need to talk about this stuff. There was somebody in my program who said, she literally said, she's like, you know, I agree with BLM and everything, but it's too controversial. I'm not going to talk about it in my class. I'm sorry, people like that should not be teachers. I'm just going to say it as it is. So as teachers, we need to use, essentially, to summarize my rant, as teachers, we need to use our privilege to talk about this stuff in our class.
Thank you so much for sharing. Does anybody else want to share about how, you know, you've brought the voices, accomplishments, and the successes of Black folks included in your lessons and units and curriculum? I personally feel like that's really important as well. And so I'd love to hear from one of you. Just jump in.
So the one thing I will say, and I'll keep it very short, is, you know, I often hear from South Asian educators and really just any educator who's not Black or Indigenous, well, how can I talk about that? Do I have any permission to talk about that? To which I go, well, you know, we also what Austin said, which is that they frame it as very controversial to be talking about it. And to which I go, well, can you talk about white history? Can you talk about controversial topics like Terra Nullius and bring that into your class? Do you already do that? Because the textbook has it. And so you're already doing that. Why can't you also include Black and Indigenous voices instead, perhaps? And so, you know, when you start to counter the fact that they are agents for white supremacy, a lot of folks, which a lot of educators are not aware of at all, because we treat curriculum like the Bible, which it is not at all, it forces them to have to critique their own positions on how they themselves are becoming those agents. And so that's always my throwback question to that. And I think it needs to be said to more educators so they can shift their position and what they consider to be controversial and risky.
Thanks. Hona, oh, sorry. Do you mind? I just wanted to hear from Hona, from your perspective. Like, I mean, how did you get to where you were in high school? Love to hear about that. And also would love to hear what your parents thought about all the work that you were doing as a Brown person and coming from a Brown family.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually very fortunate. My family is very supportive of the work I do. And to kind of add to what Julius was saying, my mom is actually an educator. She's an elementary school teacher. And so, you know, throughout my education, elementary school, high school, I can't name a single time that I learned anything about Black history, about Indigenous history, not once actually. And so an example that I've kind of seen from my mom as an anti-racist educator is that she's, you know, implemented curriculum regarding anti-Indigenous racism, residential schools, slavery, and anti-Black racism. And she's teaching grade 4 students. And often what people will say to her is that, you know, aren't these students too young? This might be traumatizing for them. And what she says about it is, you know, how old were the students in residential schools? How old were the students? You know, how old were these Black students? And so when you kind of use that excuse, it's an excuse to not talk about it. But if there were students and kids who are experiencing these traumas, then it is something that we need to talk about in order to make our Black and Indigenous students feel safe and heard in these spaces. And so yeah, I definitely look up to my mom in that sense, because I wish I had a teacher like that when I was younger. But when I got into high school, I became very much, I'd say, disturbed by kind of how institutions like schools were addressing racialized people. So, for example, I kind of saw how my economics and social studies teachers were only bringing up my culture in order to kind of create this like white savior complex. And so I got very much interested in that sense, and that's the point when I joined my school board's Human Rights and Equity Advisory Committee, and I got to work alongside board members in issues regarding equity and human rights. And so I was very much disturbed by this, considering the fact that, this was actually a committee where I heard a trustee say that there was too much Black leadership within the committee, although there is absolutely no Black voice within our board. And so I myself, along with various Black community organizers and students, were consistently kind of silenced within this community, within this committee. And so that's when I ended up running for student trustee, seeing kind of the way that racialized students and organizers were treated within the Hamilton community. And so when I ran for student trustee, I promised the students that, I would be fighting for equity and for the safety of racialized students throughout my term. And so that's kind of what I did throughout the entirety of my term. You guys can probably see that by the story that's come out recently at the end of my term. But yeah, so I was very fortunate to kind of have that support from my family throughout this process. And I think that's obviously something that's very, very important, because I wouldn't be able to do this work without their support. But I think on top of that, it's important for me to recognize that I would not have the ability to do this work and to call out these racist structures within the board without the Black Muslim women in my life, the Black mentors I have in my life, who have, mentored me, taught me about issues of anti-racism, and, allowed this space for me and allowed this platform for me.
Thank you so much for sharing. Vaquita, did you want to share your thoughts?
Oh, okay, just really quick. I was just going to say that that when we're, first of all, yes, Hona, you're amazing. And I completely agree. But I also just wanted to say that as an educator, especially a South Asian or Indo-Caribbean educator, one thing that I found that is incredibly important for educators to remember is when you're planning lessons, looking at not presenting lessons through a deficit lens. And I think that that's incredibly important. And when we're using culturally responsive pedagogies, not just relegating indigeneity and Blackness to cultural tropes and deficit lenses, and simply talking about, residential schools and slavery without the context of resistance, resilience, advocacy, the actual history, a fulsome history, rather than that the white supremacy wants us to perpetuate, which is that something is relegated to the past, and that it was such a long time ago, and that it was such a deficit lens. And so we need to make sure that we're not perpetuating those narratives in our classrooms as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Austin.
I just wanted to, I just forgot a part of my little speech earlier. I think we should also be not presenting a singular narrative, but rather we should teach about resistance, power of collective solidarity, and action from social justice movements. We need to talk about Black liberation and key Black figures as well. We need to talk about present battles and an abolishment future. We can't just focus on the past. So I totally agree. And we also need to make clear to our students that as brown folks, we have our privilege and we are not experts in this field at all, because often students look as their teacher as the expert. We're not experts in this. And we need to also remind them that we're also part of this learning journey. And yeah, talk about the resistance and activism as well. So yeah.
Thanks so much. Vidya?
Sure. So such great ideas here. You know, I'll add that what Austin was saying about you know, Black histories and realities and aspirations and excellence being centered in every curricular area is so necessary, and I think as well about the importance of Black intersectional identities, the importance of speaking specifically to, you know, Black Muslim identities, Black queer identities, Black women, Black folks with disabilities, the importance of not essentializing what the Black experience is as we're teaching about, you know, any identity. And I also think about the importance of relationships. You know, there's the academic part that we can take action with, and then there's the relational part that we can take action on. And in what ways are our relationships based on, you know, with Black students based on the premise of punishment and carceral logics? And in what ways are we perpetuating this idea that there's deviancy or criminality associated with Blackness, and how we deal with Black students, and how we relate to Black parents, and how we relate to Black community members? It's really thinking about how are we complicit in perpetuating narratives of deviancy, of criminality, of negative things being associated with Blackness. And I'd say, you know, I think some of the action that we need to take is also inaction. And I say this very thoughtfully because I'm thinking about, you know, the number of ways in which South Asians benefit from, you know, the informal networks and the connections and the collaborations and the favors and the nepotism and the special projects, and in all the ways that we are the benefits that we get from aligning to whiteness. And so when I say inaction, what I'm saying is that we need to actively resist the tap on the shoulder, anything that's associated with sort of being groomed for something because we're quiet enough, but, you know, edgy enough. Like there's that in between space, and we need to break that experience of being edgy enough to be considered somebody that's speaking about anti-racism, but not actually edgy enough to trouble things so that they actually change. And we need to actively resist that. So I'll say that you know, divesting from meritocracy, divesting from this idea that we're going to get some kind of kudos from doing this work. This is hard labor again. And if we are not resisting, and if we're not thinking about the histories of Black and South Asian solidarity, and not speaking to that, and not speaking to the ways that those histories have been erased in many ways, then it seems as though there's no path going forward. But there have been many paths that have been covered up, and so we need to kind of learn about them and think about them and break this idea that as South Asians we're simply compliant people that keep our heads down. I've come from two lineages of pretty intense, radical people, and I love that about my family lineages. And to come here and be taught that that's not who I can be, that I need to be quiet and compliant and keep my head down and do my work and be perseverant, is actually against it's against my ancestral way of being in the world. And so I think it's important that we revive what white supremacy has taken.
Thank you so much. We are to the end of our webinar. I feel like all of us, and I could actually listen to each of you forever. So, and to be able to be in the presence of all five of you, you definitely are all the highlight of my week. So thank you so much for these authentic and raw conversations that we have together representing our South Asian and Indo-Caribbean communities. Thank you, Julius, Vaquita, Vidya, Hona, and Austin, for such a stimulating evening. Your collective conversations has, you know, empowered all of us to think deeper and to address institutional barriers to access for Black students, their sense of belonging, their representation in institutional practices and structures, really highlighting their full potential, academic success, excellence, and their overall well-being in the classroom and beyond. You have all challenged the deficit narrative of Black excellence and really pushed us to explore how to ensure we as South Asians and Indo-Caribbeans support our Black student accomplishments. Thank you to the audience for your participation. Though we cannot see you, we feel your presence. We would like to note that our webinar today doesn't cover everything, and it would be impossible to cover well over 400 years of anti-Black racism in one evening. Please be mindful that this is a webinar series and the topics we have may missed or skimmed over will be discussed in future webinars and in our social media. Please follow us on Instagram at South Asian Allyship, follow our Twitter and Facebook pages. We would love to receive your feedback and suggestions for future topics and where to improve. Also, please do your work and explore and probe further by accessing our resources that we have provided for you tonight. I hope you're inspired by our guest speakers to learn and unlearn, to really break these institutional structures that benefit us as South Asian Indo-Caribbean communities but disadvantage our Black and Indigenous communities. We would not be here on this settler colonial state without our Black Indigenous communities and their fights. We have to remember that Black and Indigenous communities are not only fighting for their liberation, but they're fighting for ours as well. And we owe this to them. This is our duty to fight alongside of them. In the coming weeks, we will have a virtual meet and greet with the team members of the South Asian Allyship Network for all of you to learn more and about how to get involved. We would love to expand the South Asian Allyship Network, and we are looking for more members and volunteers who are inclusive of the South Asian and Indo-Caribbean communities, really representing our intersectional identities that we hold. The South Asian Allyship Network is in firm solidarity with our Black communities in the ongoing global struggle against police brutality and anti-Black racism. Together, we will urge our South Asian and Indo-Caribbean communities and the Canadian government to take action against anti-Blackness. We must go beyond our solidarity statements and do the work that needs to be done in order to erase anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity in our local contexts. We should ask ourselves what we are willing to put on the line and give up, including time, resources, and labor, in order for Black and Indigenous lives to truly matter and flourish. Have a good night. Again, thank you to our speakers. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you.